Well, I want to pull together a number of threads that we've been assembling so far. In particular, to come back to place Rorty space, in philosophical space, somewhat differently than he looked to us before we had Price on board. And I'm going to do that by looking at these pieces of Price, the truth is convenient friction, and why not in particular. So let me remind you that Rorty substantially redescribed the pragmatism that he inherited and thereby transformed it. After Rorty, pragmatism became linguistic pragmatism. His is a pragmatism after the linguistic turn, which, remember, was his phrase, the title of the book he edited in 1966. Pragmatism after the linguistic turn that puts language at the center of the stage in a way that it was not for James or even for Dewey, his predecessors in the strand of pragmatism that Misak distinguishes. This is what I've talked about in terms of his vocabulary, which urges us always to look at what vocabulary we're specifying, in particular, the ends of the representational relation, the representings and the representeds in. But pragmatism in Rorty's hands becomes pragmatism about specifically discursive practice, linguistic practice. And it's that redescription that lets him see not only Quine, who sometimes was willing to call himself a pragmatist, being a student of C.I. Lewis, but also Sellers, who typically resisted the terminology, Davidson, who was not comfortable with it. He could see all of them as pragmatists in this sense of linguistic pragmatism. Another figure that I'll be talking about a lot today is Michael Dummett. Rorty's linguistic pragmatism lets us see Dummett also as a Rortyian style pragmatist, though Rorty didn't write about his contemporary Dummett, and Dummett would have been horrified at the pragmatist title. But it's also under this heading of linguistic pragmatism that Rorty can smoothly assimilate the later Wittgenstein as a pragmatist. So this was a real transformation of the tradition, sort of retrospectively. Rorty redescribed discursive practice in normative terms. Wanted us to look at the norms, particularly of justification, of giving reasons to each other. And then adopted what I've called social pragmatism about normativity, the view that normative statuses are always and everywhere social statuses, that to talk about norms, to talk about proprieties, commitments, entitlements, authority, responsibility, is always to talk about social statuses that are conferred. And it's a consequence of that, a fairly immediate consequence, that the norms governing linguistic practice have to be intelligible in terms internal to that practice. If we're going to say that a norm is in play, we have to be able to underwrite that claim by pointing to features of their practice that have instituted that norm. And in his mature thinking, this is the source of his anti-representationalism, that he thinks of representational relations following Kant, but also I think Sellers. He thinks of representational relations in normative terms, in terms of the authority that the represented thing has, its function of providing a standard of correctness, a standard for the assessment of the correctness of what count as representings, just in virtue of being responsible for their correctness in that distinctive sense to what they count as representing. And this is the source of his pragmatism as anti-authoritarianism, saying no, to think of the overarching semantic norms that determine the contentfulness of our thoughts and utterances in representational terms violates his social pragmatism about normativity. So I hope that's a rehearsal of sort of familiar characterizations of Rorty. And it's at this point and on this stage that Price comes into view. And Price is a constructive pragmatist theorist in a way that Rorty is not. He wants to play by Rorty's rules, but he wants to see how much of traditional semantic discourse can be reconstructed in terms that ought to be acceptable to Rorty. These are also the Rortyian rules of the game here are also the rules of the subject naturalist, though we're looking at work of Price's that antedates him introducing that those locutions. But he's going to start by describing our practices, what we do in a pragmatic metavocabulary. And his first and most important move is going to be to disagree with Rorty that the only norms we can see in play governing discursive practice are norms of justification. Rorty draws a sharp distinction between norms of justification and norms of truth. The norms of justification, he says, that's a matter of the relations among us discursive practitioners. I justify myself to you, you challenge a claim that I've made, you accept or don't accept my justification, treat me as entitled to my claim or not, according to standards of evidence of justification that are internal to the practices of the community. Whereas truth, traditionally construed as correspondence to reality, that's a paradigm of a notion that is articulating a supposed dimension of normative authority that isn't exercised by us, that's exercised by what we're talking about, the reality that is providing the truth makers. And Price has a new way of trying to make sense of truth as a norm that's instituted by the practices of the community and is internal to those practices. And so something that a Rortyian pragmatist ought to be able to accept. And he does this in these two, principally in these two essays, the one on the Moans that I'm not much going to discuss, and this, I think, fabulous essay of his truth as convenient friction. I suppose it's obvious the pun that he's making in the title. Truth as convenient fiction is what one expects a sort of pragmatist to say here. It's a good thing to talk as though there were truth. That's the sort of thing that Rorty's willing to say. Rorty is happy with disquotational notions of truth, what I've called deflationary notions of truth, because those are purely intralinguistic. And he says that there is also what he calls the cautionary use of truth, where I say, look, I've followed all the rules of justification. I have good reasons for what I say. What I'm saying is assertable. I'm justified in it. Still, I could be wrong. Maybe what I say isn't true. That's always a possibility. And Rorty thinks that cautionary use of true can also be funded just in terms of the practices of the community. I'm implicitly looking forward to a possibility that there's more evidence than I have right now, that somebody comes up and says, yeah, but you haven't considered these facts or this evidence. If you consider all these reasons, you'll see that you're not justified in the claim you make. So there's a sort of epistemic humility, fallibilism that I can about the stability and robustness of my status as being justified in making this claim, that I can express saying, well, even though everything, all the evidence that I have points in this direction and says that I'm entitled to this claim, still maybe eventually we'll find out more and I won't be entitled to the claim. That's really all Rorty thinks we're saying with that cautionary use of true. But Price thinks there's a more robust truth norm in play that's distinct from the norm of justification, the norm that enjoins us to have reasons for the claims that we make, to be entitled to them by the lights of our community. Price actually sees three distinct levels of norms in discursive practice. A norm of sincerity, that you shouldn't say it if you're not really committed to it. You shouldn't be misleading people about what your commitments are. A norm of justification that since it's always in order for people to challenge you, to demand a justification, to demand that you exhibit the credentials for your making this claim, what entitles you to the commitment you've undertaken. There's a norm of justification. That's what Rorty thinks is the principal discursive norm. And we can put to one side now this cautionary use that is sort of pointing forward to possible changes in the evidential status of my claim. But Price is interested in a norm of truth that goes beyond the norm of justification. So if you look at the passages on the first page of the handout, he says in the last two sentences of the first quote, indeed, this is the very essence of the norm of truth, in my view. It gives disagreement its immediate normative character, a character on which dialogue depends, and a character which no lesser norm could provide. So in the introduction to this essay, he's indicating that the feature of discursive practice that he's going to appeal to in order to discern an implicit truth norm that goes beyond the norms of justification that Rorty would allow is going to focus on disagreement. That's the feature of our practice that he has. In the second passage, he says he's going to distinguish these three norms: sincerity, justification, and truth itself. I say he pretty much puts the sincerity norm to one side. It doesn't really play any role in the argument. End of the third quote there. Truth is the grit that makes individual opinions engage with one another. Truth puts the cogs in cognition, at least in its public manifestations. The cogs, picture of them engaging with each other. In this next quote, I somehow mistranscribed, so there's a phrase missing, but Price quotes Rorty concerning his own view of truth. Rorty describes himself as oscillating between Jamesian pragmatism on the one hand and deflationism on the other, swinging back and forth between trying to reduce truth to justification, reduce is missing there, and propounding some form of minimalism about truth. And in the next quote, Price tells us what he's trying to do. His view of truth is also pragmatist. He's playing by Rorty's rules. He aims to play by Rorty's rules, for it explicates truth in terms of its role in practice. I'd say it's a little bit more precise to say the truth norm in terms of its role in practice. But in another sense, it conflicts with pragmatism. He just means with Rorty's version of it, for it opposes the proposal that we identify truth with justification. And then I would skip to the last third of page 2 in the handout. There really is a third norm, we're inclined to think, even if these simple creatures don't know it. So he's imagining creatures, moans, M-O-A, who make merely opinionated assertions. These are assertions that can't conflict with one another, where there's no possibility of disagreement. In the other essay on the Moans, he gets the same initials, but he calls it minimal optative assertions, because in both cases, the paradigm is me saying something like, I think vanilla ice cream tastes good. Well, I've said something, but it's not something you can really disagree with. There's no, this is what he means, the grit of disagreement is missing with it. He says there really is a third norm, we're inclined to think, even if these simple creatures, the Moans, don't know it. If two of them make incompatible assertions, then one of them must be objectively incorrect, even if by their lights they both meet the only norms they themselves recognize. Without that, the notion of improving our commitments would be incoherent. The third norm doesn't, I'm skipping down in the quotations, doesn't just hold open the conceptual space for the idea of improvement, it positively encourages such improvements by motivating speakers who disagree to try and resolve their disagreement. I'll call this the active account of the role of the third norm. In effect, it contends the fact that speakers take their belief-expressing utterances to be subject to the third norm, say what that is in a minute, plays a causal carrot and stick role in encouraging them to settle their differences in cases in which they initially disagree. And you'll see in the passages that I've marked in objectionable yellow on page 3, he talks about the practical disagreement. That's the pragmatic phenomenon. And that underlying it is the notion of a primitive incompatibility between different utterances. So here, third passage from the bottom on page 3, recall that I began by challenging Rorty's claim that no behavioral consequences flow from a distinction between justification and truth. In one sense, my challenge does indeed amount to pointing out the third norm, a notion of truth stronger than justification that brings with it the following behavioral difference: a disposition to criticize or at least disapprove of those with whom one disagrees. Without truth, the wheels of argument don't engage, disagreements slide past one another. And here, the crucial point he's concluding is that assertoric dialogue requires an intolerance of disagreement. That needs to be present already in the background, a pragmatic presupposition of assertion itself. So the way I reconstruct this argument, he's saying discursive practice that's recognizable as our making claims, assertions, what he's agreeing is the downtown of discursive practice, that discursive practice is demarcated by some performances having the significance in it of claimings. That's something Wittgenstein disagrees with, but Huw, I think, is taking it as a premise. And then his claim is, and it's essential to that practice that it's possible for us to disagree, that you have made a claim and I can make an incompatible claim, a claim that rules that out. So there's implicitly a relation of rational incompatibility between claims that is stronger than mere difference. In one of the passages on page 2 of the handout, he talks about turning mere difference into genuine disagreement. So if I say, I think vanilla ice cream tastes good, and you say, I think strawberry ice cream tastes good, we've said different things, but we haven't disagreed in any way. That's merely different claims. Or if I say the sign is red, and you say the sign is octagonal, we've said different things, but we haven't disagreed. But the claim is that for us really to be making a claim, some of the claims have got to be incompatible. They've got to rule out that making the one claim rules out the other claim. I would say committing yourself to the one precludes your being entitled to the other, but that's already giving a conceptual analysis of this notion of incompatibility. But now, where's the invocation of truth in this? He's saying, well, truth is the property that we're saying both of these commitments can't have if they disagree. What we're saying when we say that if you and I genuinely disagree, if our claims are incompatible, when we say, well, then one of us must be wrong. It's not settled yet who's wrong, but one of us must be wrong. That judgment of wrongness on the basis of the incompatibility of the commitments manifested in the practical phenomenon of disagreement is intelligible as saying they can't both be true. That the notion of truth is implicit in incompatibility and so in disagreement. So the practical basis for this truth norm is the idea that if you and I disagree, we can't both be right. Some one of us is wrong. And he thinks that the fact that we could paraphrase that somebody must be wrong by saying both these claims cannot be true, that's the key use of truth in a sense that is stronger than justification. Now, what's the argument that it's stronger than justification? And here I think he sort of buries his, he makes the argument, but doesn't underline it in the text, so it's easy to miss it as it goes by. This claim that you and I disagree, so one of us must be wrong. The fundamental source of a truth norm, he's saying, that's independent of the justificatory status of my claim or your claim. It swings free of what reasons I have for my claim and what reasons you have for your claim. What justifies you and justifies me, we don't even need to go into that in order to know that if they're incompatible, one of us is wrong. And so, so he's saying that this norm that he's pointing out is independent of our assessment of who's justified or entitled to their claims by reasons, because we don't need to look at that in order to put in play, to apply and practice this norm that says, if the claims are incompatible, if we genuinely disagree, then at least one of us is wrong. And it's that sense of wrong that he's saying goes beyond a notion of justification, because we don't even need to look at what justifies us in order to say that. And furthermore, we can see it as constraining our assessments of justification. We're saying, well, there's something wrong in addition with somebody's justification for this, because at least one of you must be wrong. So if we have a notion of assertability as being entitled to perform a speech act by whatever the practices of the community are, what Rorty characteristically sort of self-caricatures by saying, whatever you can get away with, whatever your community lets you get away with, that's to emphasize that it is the justificatory standards of the community, what counts as an appropriate speech act, when you're entitled to make. This notion of incompatibility, that's incompatibility of contents of the claims, that is implicit in the notion, in the possibility of disagreement with them, that's not reducible to this justificatory status. It's antecedent to it, and in a certain sense constrains that. So that's the way I would reconstruct the argument. The pieces of it that to be discursive practice, some performances need to have the status of assertions, of claims. claims that we would express with declarative sentences saying, things are thus and so. And no practice could be intelligible as conferring that significance on speech acts unless it allowed the possibility of disagreement. That's the second step. And then an analysis, the disagreement involves treating the expressions of the disagreement as having incompatible contents, which we could paraphrase by saying they can't both be true, but which is practically significant in that if you and I disagree, which we're analyzing as making claims that have incompatible contents, then at least one of us must be wrong. Something's wrong about the situation that needs to be fixed. And that we can know that without looking at what entitled us or the extent to which we're entitled to make these claims. Maybe I just made a wild claim that I have no justification for, and you actually have a worked out argument for your claim. Maybe we both have arguments, maybe neither of us do. The issue of disagreement doesn't depend on that. The fact that somebody's wrong doesn't depend on what the justificatory status is. So he wants to say the norm that's implicit in the kind of practical wrongness that there is, that we recognize in recognizing that you and I disagree, that's not reducible to justification. So let me stop there for thoughts about this line of argument. Yeah, Katja.
Thank you. Is it right that this notion of truth is practically diametrically different from that of Davidson's? Because both are thinking that truth is a kind of presupposition for assertion or for interpreting or for communication. But while Davidson's notion of truth is focusing on agreement, and he wants to rule out incompatibility, Price's notion is based on disagreement, and it has incompatibility as an implicit presupposition. Would you think that this is correct?
They're certainly coming at it, as you say, from opposite ends of the terrain. Now, are they in the end compatible with one another? That's a more complicated question. I mean, I'll want to lay out an argument parallel to Price's a little bit later on that I think brings us closer to the Davidsonian one. But Davidson makes nothing of disagreement. Which is the convenient friction of this essay. Davidson is always focusing on the smoothness of interpretation and of conversation. Price is focusing our attention elsewhere. But I mean, yeah, James.
Thanks. I wonder if Price's view of truth isn't just Rortyian justification by another name, because it seems to me that Rorty wants to expand justification enough so that it includes this possibility of disagreement. He just has a very different story about why the disagreement matters, because for him, it's supposed to turn on very specific cooperative projects and whether or not we have something at stake. But it certainly seems open to Rorty to say that there is a more global notion of disagreement that's important to justification, which is that we need to be able to cooperate in general and sort of coming together with solidarity in our judgments or something. So, I mean, I wonder if Price's pragmatic story really is getting to something that should be called truth, or if it isn't just something that's a dressed up justificatory role?
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question. Price certainly means to be offering a friendly amendment to Rorty. As he said, you know, he wants to play by Rorty's pragmatist rules, that we shouldn't see any norms as governing our practice that we can't understand as instituted by our practices. And he wants to say, well, this obviously is. This norm is instituted by our treating some claims as incompatible with others in a sense that makes genuine disagreement intelligible. The sense in which he's disagreeing with Rorty is he's saying, look, you're moving too hastily in thinking that the only norm that we can make sense of by your rules, but by the pragmatist constraint that any norm has to be intelligible as instituted by the practices of the community. The only mistake is that you thought the only one was a matter of how justified I am. What credentials that are accepted by the community I can present for my claim. I mean, I put it that way rather than just evidence because one of the ways you can be entitled, for instance, is by making a non-inferential report of something that, you know, we're generally thought to be reliable about, you know, the shapes and colors of things and so on. And that isn't, you know, a matter of the evidence I have, but of me being a reliable reporter. On the other hand, you know, if I claim that it's raining and you ask me, you know, what reason do I have for that? What evidence do I have for that? And I say, well, the streets are wet. Okay, then I have, according to the community, a reason. But I think Price understands himself just to be extending Rorty's account and saying, look, you don't need to be disagreeing with ordinary usage to the extent that you take it you're obliged to be by your pragmatist scruples. You can allow that there's a truth norm that transcends the narrow justificatory norm that you allow. In some sense, it's of the same kind. That's why he thinks it ought to be acceptable to a Rortyian pragmatist. So, you know, I think he thinks of it as a minor emendation of a minor correction of Rorty's view, but one that then entitles Rorty, while holding on to his pragmatist principles, to speak more with the philosophic vulgar. That is, it entitles Rorty as a pragmatist to talk more the way the tradition talks, distinguishing truth from justification, seeing those as norms that can come apart. I mean, remember some while ago, I suggested a different way of doing the same thing, invoking the distinction of social perspective between attitudes of attributing normative statuses and attitudes of acknowledging or undertaking them in connection with the JTB, justified true belief, account of knowledge, and understanding attributions of knowledge as corresponding to the belief condition, the attribution of a commitment, corresponding to the justification condition, the attribution of an entitlement, and corresponding to the truth condition, not the attribution of anything, but the undertaking of that same commitment. And that's another way of underwriting in terms of our practices, in terms that ought to be acceptable to Rorty, a difference between a norm of justification and a norm of truth in the way that comes out in needing those separate conditions on attributions of knowledge. So this is, I think, characteristic of post-Rortian pragmatism, that what I was trying to do with that social perspectival account is generically the same thing that Price is trying to do, that is, accept Rorty's scruples and rules of the game, but reconstruct more of philosophical common sense talk about our practices in pragmatist terms, rather than, as Rorty tends to do, simply rejecting those ways of talking. Say, well, look, you can't reconstruct those in the ways that you are entitled to as a pragmatist. Yes, Amy.
I have two questions. So the first one is on the conception of norms. So I wonder what Price's conception of norm is. I take it there's a deflationary conception of norms, which is just a majority of people in a society having the same disposition. Would you say his conception of norms is this or something more than that?
I think he is self-consciously non-committal about that at this period. He's willing to take whatever Rorty, however Rorty wants to talk about norms, in whatever sense there's a norm of justification, that you're subject to criticism if you make a claim, undertake a commitment that you're not entitled to, that you're subject to criticism, maybe sanctions by the community. And those sanctions don't need to be that they'll beat you with sticks. It might just be that they won't make any inferences from the claim you made. They don't treat it as having any authority. That might be enough to show that they were treating what you did as inappropriate. And here he's just pointing out that insofar as we think that when you and I disagree, that one of us must be wrong, that we're implicitly acknowledging that there's a norm there, that they can't both be right in a sense that goes beyond justified, because we could both be justified, at least until we realize that something's wrong because we disagree. So I think he's going to take it as a virtue of his account that he doesn't need to commit himself. So whatever pragmatist acceptable notion of normativity, in whatever sense you think norms are implicit in the doings of the community, in the way we take or treat each other's performances, whatever your understanding of that is, an argument like this is going to go through.
Thanks. My second question is on my own reading of the situation. I take it that Rorty kind of admits that there's a further disposition to solve disagreement among people in various situations. And I read Price as suggesting that there's an important subset of this disposition of the situations in which people disagree on what the truth is. And it plays a important theoretical function or something. Would you say this is more or less accurate?
I think that's right. That is, well, Rorty accepted, I mean, you're thinking about this response that Rorty gave to the Price thing. I mean, he was very appreciative of what Price was doing with his pragmatist ideas. I mentioned that at the very end of Rorty's life, he was a big fan of Price's subject naturalism, object naturalism way of talking about sort of how to be a pragmatist, anti-representationalist, to say, oh yeah, the pragmatists are the subject naturalists and they're rejecting the representationalist semantic presuppositions of object naturalism. He was very, very admiring of that conceptual move. And so I think he saw Price as a kindred spirit, as working within the pragmatist, linguistic pragmatist enterprise, but wanted to push back and say, well, really, aren't you talking about the fine structure of the kind of norm of justification that I was acknowledging that there is, rather than it's being some additional norm? And here, I'm not sure exactly how things would go. One of the things Price doesn't discuss, and Rorty doesn't either, though it seems to me the obvious place to focus their disagreement, is just what difference does it make that this is dialogical disagreement? That is, we could already say, well, I'm subject to criticism if I have incompatible commitments. That's going to affect my justificatory status. If I've got two incompatible commitments, then either one of them serves as a reason against the other. So you can, as it were, refute me out of my own mouth. I myself have endorsed a reason against the other claim that I have. Something's wrong. Is it the case that the kind of wrongness that Price sees as implicitly acknowledging a truth norm, does that kind of wrongness already come up in the one subject case, where I have the incompatible commitments and, as it were, disagree with myself? Or is there something essential to the argument that you and I disagree? You have the one commitment and I have the other. And I can read Rorty's response to Price as saying, look, that norm was already implicit in the one person case. When I was talking about justification, that you would assess me as not entitled to my commitments if they're incompatible with one another, even though they're both my commitments. And there isn't any substantial difference between the one person case and the two person case. It looks as though Price thinks it makes a difference, that it's interpersonal disagreement. In the way I reconstructed his argument, it's not clear that you can't run it just with one person. So, suppose, I haven't, I'm not making a claim here that there's no difference between the one person and the two person case. I'm raising it as an issue. And there's also a question of how that would bear on whether we ought to see Price's emendation as adding a new norm or is pointing out something potentially important about the fine structure of the kind of justificatory norm that Rorty already was talking about, and that really, the way Rorty seems to think about it, okay, Rorty was painting with too broad a brush, was making sweeping claims about a norm of justification without paying attention to important structural features of it. Well, let me just point out that Rorty had already allowed a cautionary use of truth. And I think Price is right. That's not the notion that Price reconstructs here. His is different. He's got a new pragmatist strategy that goes beyond the cautionary use of truth. It's also not the Jamesian notion of truth. When Rorty was saying that he oscillates back and forth, he himself oscillates back and forth between wanting to have a Jamesian, the truth is what works, sort of view. He sometimes will use the rhetoric, that's the part of Neurath's boat that we're currently leaving alone. That's the claims that we don't see any good reason to contest. Those are sort of linguistic versions of the Jamesian instrumentalist notion. And Rorty was saying he goes back and forth between wanting to reconstruct the notion of truth in acceptable pragmatist terms in something like the Jamesian way, and wanting to explain it away in the deflationary sort of way. And I just want to point out that, Price's reconstruction isn't either of those. It's not the Jamesian instrumentalist, and he's not just deflating it. Semantic minimalism, okay, that's something about our use of truth, but there's a truth norm that goes beyond that, he's saying. And it's not that it works, or these are the planks that we sit still. It's not invoking the community in that way. It's not Dewey's notion of warranted assertability. That's the closest ancestor of Rorty's. And that's the one that Sellers invokes a notion of semantic assertability. And that's the one Dummett invokes for his anti-realism, which is a kind of pragmatism. He says we should think in terms of assertability instead of in terms of truth. This is connected to his thinking we should use intuitionistic logic instead of classical logic. Assertability is not going to underwrite bivalence, but Price is specifically arguing that this goes beyond that. And at least as normally conceived, it does go beyond it, even if at the end of the day we want to say it's articulating the fine structure of that. It also is not the conception, not Peirce's conception of truth as what will be warranted in believing at the ideal end of inquiry. I mentioned that Peircean, that was Peirce's attempt to get an acceptably pragmatist version of truth that went beyond justification here and now. Well, it's justification in that one far off divine event towards which the whole creation moves. And I mentioned Crispin Wright's super assertability version of that, that says, well, the notion of truth that goes beyond assertability, justification here and now, is assertability here and now that's robust under arbitrary improvements of our information. And you remember I criticized that because the notion of additions to our information is either circularly invoking a notion of truth. If it isn't true, it's not information, or makes the definition give us the wrong thing, because if information is just whatever we think is true, being robust under arbitrary additions of that isn't going to get you to truth. Anyway, Price has a new pragmatist strategy. It's not any of those strategies. And if you think there's anything to the pragmatist line of thought, that's a big deal. And I'll just mention this was his first foray into the philosophy of language from the intense philosophy of physics stuff that he had done. This was 18 months after his book on time came out. So, that the philosophy of physics got him to think about pragmatist philosophy of language. And this is what he came up with when he did. Now, I want to lay alongside this an argument that's near and dear to my heart. It's in the Truth and Assertability piece that I put in the supplementary reading, not figuring that you would read it, but just so it would be available there when I talk about it. This argument was the core of my doctoral dissertation. I say it's near and dear to my heart, but it was an attempt to do the same thing that Price did. That is, to underwrite a notion of truth conditions that's available to do semantic work that a notion of assertability can't do, but that can be reconstructed entirely in pragmatist approved, out of pragmatist approved raw materials and by pragmatist approved construction methods. And here the key point was that classical assertability theorists looked at the relation of being a reason for. To be assertable is to be entitled by the standards of your community, and principal among the ways of being entitled is having reasons, being able to give evidence, being able to respond to a challenge by vindicating your entitlement, by asserting something else that stands in this reason for relation, evidential relation to the claim you made. But assertability theorists only looked upstream to what counts as a reason for the claim that you're making. They didn't look at what follows from the claim you're making, at what it's a reason for. And if you do, you can see a difference between justification and truth. So for instance, we can have two claims that have the same assertability conditions, that you can be justified in making the one claim just under the circumstances in which you're justified in making the other. So I say, I will write a book about Rorty. Hey, I'm spending the semester thinking about it. I might make that prediction. So there's my first claim is, I will write a book about Rorty. But I can also say, I predict that I'll write a book about Rorty. I foresee that I will write a book about Rorty. Well, we can at least regiment a use of foresee or predict such that whenever I'm entitled to actually do that, to say, I will write a book about Rorty, I'm also justified, entitled to say that that's what I'm doing by saying, I foresee, I predict that I will write a book about Rorty. Now, intuitively, we want to say they have the same assertability conditions, but they don't have the same truth conditions. It could be true that I foresee and predict that I'll write this book, and not true that I will. If I get hit by a bus or die of the plague tomorrow, it will not be true that I will write a book about Rorty. But it still would be true that I predict, that I foresee that I will. The fact that I can be entitled to the one under just the same circumstances that I'm entitled to the other doesn't mean they're true under the same circumstances. Well, how can we see that without, I mean, what does that assessment of truth make? Well, if we look downstream to what follows from those claims, we see they have different consequences. So for instance, from the claim, I will write a book about Rorty, it follows that I will write a book about Rorty. The stuttering inference is as solid as one can be. And it doesn't follow from the claim that I predict that I'll write a book about Rorty, that I will write a book about Rorty. There are lots of orphan volume ones embarrassing their authors out there in the libraries where people predicted that they were going to write another book that they didn't, for one reason or another, write. And so my claim was that talk about truth conditions was talk about what followed from a claim. The justification is looking upstream to what are reasons for the claim, and assessments of truth conditions are looking downstream to what that claim is a reason for. Michael Dummett, the philosopher of language, I'm claiming is a pragmatist, distinguishes between the circumstances of application of a claim and the consequences of application of a claim, and says assertability theories are literally one-sided. They only look at half of the meanings of things. They only look at the circumstances of application. But two expressions can have the same circumstances of application and different consequences of application. I just gave some examples of those. And he thinks it would be equally one-sided to be a verificationist and only look at the consequences of application. Well, that suggests that there's two dimensions of norm, two kinds of norms that are involved in the use of expressions. The upstream norms of what entitles you to make the commitment, and the downstream norms of what follows from it. I mean, Dummett has other observations using this circumstances of application and consequences of application model that are philosophically interesting. So he suggests, for instance, that if we look at the concept of the validity of an argument in first order predicate calculus, that a student might learn the rules for, I don't know, doing truth tables, if we just stay at the propositional level, and be able to give sufficient reasons for something to be a valid argument. They could get mastery of the circumstances of application of the predicate valid. But we wouldn't say they understood validity unless they knew what followed from applying that predicate, namely that any argument that was valid was truth preserving, that if its premises were true, its conclusion was true. If they only had the circumstances of application, but not the consequences of application, we wouldn't say they understood the concept. And again, he says, if we think about a philosophically fraught concept like personal identity, we all pretty much agree on what the consequences of applying that concept are. To say this person's stage is the same as this person's stage, the consequences, he says, are more or less forensic. They have to do with co-responsibility. All the disagreement between bodily continuity people and memory people and so on, all the disagreement is about the circumstances of application. Well, there's more going on in the truth and assertability essay than just this argument. Indeed, when I look back on it through these eyes, it seems to me I was trying to do 12 different things at the same time. And when I got them all teased out, those were the main strains of making it explicit. No wonder it took me forever to disentangle them. But if you just think about this attempt to get a notion of truth that contrasts with the notion of justification as assertability, as justification upstream, by looking at the consequences downstream, I think it's eerily parallel to Price's argument. I'm looking entirely at the practice of extracting consequences from a claim. That is, I'm looking at what the claim is a reason for. I'm looking at relations of implication that it stands in downstream. Price is looking at relations of being a reason against, underwritten by incompatibility relations. The parallel is we're both moving beyond what would justify you or entitle you in making a commitment, in undertaking a commitment, what makes it assertable. We're going beyond that with me looking downstream at what that claim is a reason for, appealing to implication relations, and he's looking downstream at what that claim gives you a reason against, what it's incompatible with. Reasons for, reasons against, it's the same move. We're both looking downstream rather than looking upstream, and saying traditional pragmatists, assertability theorists, were too focused on what justifies a claim, what's a reason for it. They don't look at what it's a reason for and what it's a reason against. But if you do look at those things, which there's no reason for a pragmatist not to, then you can underwrite truth talk by means that are hygienic according to the scruples of Rortian pragmatists. So we can see an enterprise in post-Rortian linguistic pragmatists to accept his account of really what meta vocabulary we're entitled to use to talk about our discursive practices. That it's only what we can underwrite in terms of an account of what people are doing and what norms are implicit in their practices. They're taking or practically taking or treating each other's performances in one way rather than another. And both Price and I responded to this as a constructive theoretical challenge, to say, well, what semantic metavocabulary can you entitle yourself to use playing by those rules, by those pragmatist rules? Rorty, from our point of view, was too quick to conclude that some parts of our ordinary, to be sure, high theoretical philosophical vocabulary couldn't be justified that way. And so to dismiss them and teach us to try and talk without them at the pain of making his views look wilder and more radical than they needed to be. I mean, they're radical enough, but he made it worse because he didn't see how you could construct some of these notions or analogs of these notions in ways that were respectable by his lights. So I see Rorty as having transformed the pragmatist tradition by making the linguistic turn, introducing the vocabulary. And what's distinctive of Huw's and my generation, post-Rortyian generation of pragmatists, is our taking, rather than a skeptical set of conclusions that Rorty drew, or anyway, rather than being skeptical about all of them, saw that as a constructive theoretical challenge to reconstruct as much of the usable semantic vocabulary as we could in pragmatist terms. And he seized on looking downstream with reasons against and incompatibility, relations of rational incompatibility. And I look downstream at relations of consequence or implication, rational consequence or implication. He's looking at reasons against, I'm looking at reasons for, but basically we've made the same move. We said, add to your consideration of the credentials upstream of the claim and look at the consequences downstream. What other things are you entitled to by this, and what things are you precluded from being entitled to by it? Okay. Well, I think it's a good time for our break. When we come back, I want to talk about another sort of grand unification that I see here in the vicinity. That on the one hand is a unification with formal semantics and this sort of, as I'll call it, philosophical semantics that Price and I are engaged in. And that as a crucial point of synthesis of this Rortyian pragmatism with the Humean expressivist tradition that Blackburn is the avatar of, in a way that I at least found surprising as well. By way of framing this parallel between the discussion of the parallel between reasons for and reasons against in trying to find discursive norms that go beyond mere justification of the sort that was all Rorty could find. I want to mention a couple of passages from Price's article, Why Not? Why negation in it? Because it bears on and sort of fills in the argument, I think, for the essentiality to a recognizable discursive practice, that is a practice that confers the practical significance of assertion on some of its performances, of the possibility of disagreement underlying incompatibility, because his view is, you know, negation's expressive job is to express this notion of incompatibility. So the overall argument is, well, we need negation because we need rational relations of incompatibility, that is being a reason against, because we need disagreement. So once again, he does this by, here, this is in the middle of page 4 on the handout of passages. One way to approach this question, he says, is to try to imagine a community whose language does not allow for denial. Perhaps they've never developed it, or perhaps they're ideological positivists. What linguistic capabilities do they lack? I'm going to think about them as being rationally dogmatic. They only have reasons for. They don't have reasons against incompatibilities. That's the community he's trying to imagine. And I think this little dialogue that he gives afterwards in the next in the handout is quite telling. He says, where it does lie is in exhibiting conflicts between beliefs and thereby facilitating argument, well, disagreement. So here's his little dialogue. Me, Fred's in the kitchen. I set off for the kitchen. You, wait, Fred's in the garden. Me, I see, but he's in the kitchen, so I'll go there. Set off for the kitchen. You lack understanding. The kitchen is Fred free. Me, is it really? But Fred's in it, and that's the important thing. Leaves for the kitchen. If there's nothing you can say that's incompatible with my claim that Fred is in the kitchen, you can't give me the information that he's in the garden. And Price suggests so I take that to be at least suggestive of what would be broken about a rationally dogmatic practice, one that only had reasons for. So maybe in that, I have some reason to think he's in the kitchen. Maybe that's the last place I saw him. But if I can't treat anything as a reason against that, then I can't get any information from you. And there's no point to making assertions. I make assertions so that you can use information I have as premises for you to draw conclusions from, for instance, about where Fred is and isn't. Now, he suggests that we can go a little bit deeper than this in that last passage on page 4. Where might a sense of incompatibility first arise? I think there's at least 2 possible evolutionary stories. The first, which I'll call the active account, would locate our first grasp of a sense of incompatibility in our experience as agents. We often find ourselves faced with a choice between performing and not performing a specified action. That is, he's suggesting that the notion of incompatibility that's underwriting the notion of a reason against bottoms out in pragmatic terms in the fact that I can either jump in the lake or not. I can stay here standing on the dock, or I can jump in, but those are incompatible. I just can't do both of those. And he goes on to suggest that the incompatibility of claims, one being a reason against the other, is ultimately to be explained in terms of the incompatibility of one doing with another, where you can do the one or the other, but not both. He doesn't further explore this grounding relation that's rooted in relation here just sort of suggests that this is the origin. So I think two things are of note about this. First of all, it seems to me it fills in a little bit in a suggestive way the argument that a discursive practice that was rationally dogmatic in this sense only had reasons for would be radically defective. And we might lay it alongside a rationally skeptical practice that only had reasons against, which would be radically defective in another way. It depends how we told the story, but either there'd be no way to become entitled to a claim because you couldn't give reasons for it, or if we said that this was what I've elsewhere called a default and challenge structure of entitlement, where if you make a claim, you count as entitled to it until and unless somebody's got a reason against it, you wouldn't be able to answer a challenge. Someone gives you a reason against the claim, and all there are reasons against. You could maybe give a reason against their reason against, but rational activity would consist entirely of whittling down entitlements. So the suggestion is that rationally dogmatic practices aren't ultimately intelligible as discursive practices, ones that only have reasons for, and that rationally skeptical practices that only have reasons against aren't ultimately intelligible as discursive practices, that only rationally critical practices that have both reasons for and reasons against are ultimately intelligible. You have to be able to give reasons for and reasons against. And I'll just mention that I have recently been much fussed by the observation that reasons for are almost always asymmetric. If P is a reason for Q, it's usually not the case that Q is a reason for P. The fact that Coda is a dog is a reason to think Coda is a mammal, but the fact that Coda is a mammal is not a reason to think that Coda is a dog. Whereas reasons against incompatibilities are almost always symmetric. If P is a reason against Q, if it's incompatible with Q, if commitment to P precludes entitlement to Q, then commitment to Q precludes entitlement to P. And the question I don't know the answer to, though I think there's tantalizing clues, is why is that? Why is that structural difference? Why should reasons against be symmetrical, the underlying reason relations of incompatibility being symmetric, a matter of the set of them being incoherent, whereas relations of implication of reasons for are asymmetric or non-symmetric. Why is that? Is there some deeper explanation for that? And Ryan Simonelli, who some of you know, has a fabulous argument that explains why incompatibilities have to be symmetric. But I'm not going to talk about that here. I just mentioned this as a fascinating, to me, problem in the vicinity. Now, what I want to do at this point is explore further contexts for this constructive theoretical achievement of Price's that we see in his account of how semantic norms, truth norms, can go beyond, at any rate, the kind of assertability norm or justification norm that Rorty had inherited from Dewey and Sellers and used in a sort of undifferentiated way as the only kind of norm of practice he thought we could really make sense of. And so, yeah, okay. So this is now under the heading of pragmatics, semantics, and pragmatisms. So the way I use the expressions, pragmatics is the study of the use of language. It's a study of discursive practice. Rorty advises us, it's part of the vocabulary, to look at what vocabularies can we use to talk about practices, about discursive practices, to think about what can go in our pragmatic meta-vocabularies, the vocabularies we use to talk about what we're doing when we make claims. So for instance, Price thinks we should use a naturalistic, pragmatic meta-vocabulary. That's what the idea of subject naturalism is. I've suggested we might want to use a normative, pragmatic meta-vocabulary, but that could be respectable for a Rortyian pragmatist as long as we could understand the norms as implicit in social practices. Semantics is, as I'll use the term, is the study of the meanings or contents of expressions. Here I'm using the Wittgensteinian language of use and meaning. People often associate with Wittgenstein the phrase meaning is use. I assure you, Wittgenstein never wrote that. He did say in the Blue and the Brown books, and again in the investigations, don't look to the meaning, look to the use, which is pretty close. Now, I did find somebody who said meaning is use. Isaac Newton did in Principia Mathematica. It's the antecedent of a conditional. He says, if meaning is use, then, and goes on to draw the conclusion. So he's clearly endorsing it, but he says it as though this were a common phrase of his time. It's as though he's saying, if, as you'll hear people say all the time, meaning is use, then such and such. And I can't resist mentioning as I pass by here that one way to distinguish between an expert in an area like this, say Wittgenstein, and a scholar is that the expert can with authority tell you a lot of things about Wittgenstein's view, but the scholar can speak with equal authority in pronouncing negative existentials, can perform the sort of speech act that I just did. Wittgenstein nowhere says that meaning is use. And typically to perform these speech acts authoritatively takes a lifetime of study of your figure. I mean, digitally available corpora has made it a little bit easier if you're talking about a particular sequence of words, but if you want to talk about, say, Well, they never endorsed the idea of the I don't know, immortality of the human soul. Well, you can't just do a global search to find that out. So that was a scholarly remark that I made, that Wittgenstein has not said that. But we can ask, what should a pragmatist's view be about semantics? A pragmatist is going to work in a pragmatic metavocabulary, whether a naturalist or a normative or some other kind. But what should a Rortian or post-Rortian pragmatist's view be about semantic metavocabularies? And one sort of pragmatism is going to say semantic metavocabularies are never appropriate. You should only use pragmatic metavocabularies. Now, Dummett thinks of the point of doing semantics, of associating meanings with expressions, to be codifying proprieties of use, where the thought is that your theory of meaning will tell you what kind of meaning to associate with an expression, and then you'll have a pragmatic theory that will tell you how it's appropriate to do various things with that expression, to make claims with it, to issue orders, to use it in a question, and so on, in some systematic way of deriving proprieties of use from the association with it of a meaning or a content. And his reading of the later Wittgenstein is that Wittgenstein rejects any notion of meaning that plays that role. He's what we might call a semantic nihilist. He thinks you're never going to be able to codify the proprieties of use by associating meanings or contents with expressions, because the use is a motley. There will be no, and in principle will be no, uniform or systematic way of inferring or computing how it's correct to use the expression from the association with it of some semantically relevant whatsits, some content or meaning. And I've suggested before, what I take to be behind this is that he thinks it's of the essence of language that the uses change, that any codification that you could make of the proper use of the expression systematized by assignments of meanings would at most apply to a snapshot of the language and would immediately be falsified as those practices are projected into new practices, change into new practices. In our own time, the great Wittgensteinian Charles Travis is a semantic nihilist. His occasion sensitivity is a criticism of the notion that any linguistic expressions can be associated with truth conditions. This is a kind of radical context dependence, and it's slightly different from the plasticity argument that I was taking to be Wittgenstein's. But once again, he says, all you're going to be able to do is directly describe some proprieties of use. There is in principle no way to systematize those as a semantic metavocabulary would want to do. So one kind of pragmatism simply rejects semantics. And we might ask, well, is Rorty one of those? Is his pragmatism one that entails, or that he takes to entail, semantic nihilism? Dummett himself is not a semantic nihilist. He's a pragmatist behaviorist. He's not actually comfortable with either of those expressions for his view, so that's my characterization of his view. He's willing to postulate meanings, to associate meanings with expressions in order to codify proprieties of use. But the only kind of meanings that he treats as respectable are ones that can be defined in pragmatic terms. You have to be able explicitly to define the semantic contents in terms of proprieties of use. So he rejects the notion of truth conditions associated with declarative sentences in favor of, well, assertability conditions, but because we saw those would be one-sided, in favor of circumstances of application, assertability conditions, and consequences of application. And those are, if we think of the pair of circumstances and consequences of application, that's his generalization of introduction and elimination rules in a Gensen-style natural deduction system. But if we think of those circumstances and consequences of application, those can be, as he puts it, directly manifested in the behavior of practitioners. You can see when they take it to be appropriate to apply the term and what consequences they take to be appropriate to follow from applying the term. He says you can't understand singular terms in terms of a representation relation modeled on the name bearer relation, the name and what it's a name of, Fido and Fido. Can't make sense of that in terms of what you can manifest in your behavior as someone who has mastered the use of that expression. What we can have is recognition conditions. Under what circumstances do I recognize Fido, non-inferentially or inferentially, and what are the consequences of doing that? So he gives himself, helps himself to a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. It's an implicitly normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary because we're talking about circumstances of appropriate application and appropriate consequences of application. He doesn't go on to give a social theory of those implicit norms. He doesn't really tell us anything about those norms. Has not been a topic of his philosophical attention. But then he'll let us use semantic terms in a semantic meta-vocabulary if and only if they're explicitly definable in the terms of the pragmatic meta-vocabulary. Now, I said this was behaviorist. That's by analogy to the views in the philosophy of mind, where Gilbert Ryle, his Oxford predecessor and teacher, had in the concept of mind said the only respectable terms of mentalistic vocabulary are ones that are explicitly definable in terms of a behavioral vocabulary. So we're allowed to use a term like angry or irascible, provided we can define it in dispositional terms as a disposition to, yell and stomp and so on, in response to stimuli that other people would not do that for. That's what it is to be angry. And Sellers objected to that sort of what he called logical behaviorism that required explicit definability of mentalistic terms in behavioral ones, because Sellers suggested that we should instead think of the mental vocabulary as standing to the behavioral vocabulary as theoretical vocabulary stands to the vocabulary of observables. And if we think of it that way, that mental items are postulated in order to explain observable behavior, then Rileyan behaviorism is a kind of instrumentalism about theoretical entities. Instrumentalism about theoretical entities says you can only use theoretical terms if they're explicitly definable in observational terms. And Sellers took it to be one of the solid lessons we've learned in the philosophy of science is not to be instrumentalists about theoretical entities, not to eschew reference to subatomic particles just because we can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for being a mu meson in terms of things we can observe about our measuring instruments. That's the wrong grammar for them. And so, and I think Sellers is just dead right about that. And that Dummett is culpable for being a semantic instrumentalist. Here the analogy is semantic vocabulary stands to pragmatic, semantic metavocabulary stands to pragmatic metavocabulary, as theoretical vocabulary stands to observational vocabulary. That is, we postulate the association with expressions of semantic interpretants in order to explain the observable antics that we can characterize in our pragmatic metavocabulary. That's the overarching model. That's what Wittgenstein is rejecting when he says philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. It's not in the business of postulating unobservables, theoretical entities, in order to explain behavior. It has to remain at the surface and merely describe surface behavior. But I conclude that we shouldn't be semantic instrumentalists any more than we should be any other kind of instrumentalist about theoretical entities. But we can say the Dummettian position, semantic instrumentalism, is a way of being a pragmatist. Just one that I think this Salarzian critique shows as a bad one. What I want to call methodological pragmatism says that the point of postulating meanings is to codify proprieties of use in the way that the point of postulating any theoretical entities is to codify the regularities that are exhibited at in the observational, that are statable in the observational vocabulary. So I asked at the beginning, where's Rorty on this spectrum. I think he identifies semantic metavocabulary with representationalist semantic metavocabulary. And he has on his side that that's what the tradition gives us. From Descartes through Kant to Frege into the 20th century logistical tradition, Tarskian model theory and its sophisticated possible worlds successor, semantics has been representational semantics. So Rorty, rejecting representationalist semantic metavocabularies, takes the reasons he has to do that to be reasons to reject semantic metavocabularies tout court. What Price and I, each in our own way, have been urging is that there might be other kinds of semantic metavocabulary. Price's truth norm, well, truth is, as it occurs in that truth norm, the wrong that's manifested in the wrongness of incompatible commitments, that if you and I disagree in the sense that our commitments are incompatible, then at least one of us is wrong, and we can know that before we know what our reasons are for making those claims. That's a gesture at a semantic notion of truth that is respectable, well, in Demetian instrumentalist terms. It's explicitly definable in pragmatist terms. And my suggestion that we can use these broadly inferential relations, the relations of justification that assertability theorists and Rorty himself appeal to upstream, and the relations downstream of implication and consequence in what some claim is a reason for, and of incompatibility and what that claim is a reason against, that we can specify meanings in inferential terms. For instance, to use Dummett's language, in terms of the inferential commitments that's curled up inside, well, in between the circumstances and consequences of application. Because using a term with certain circumstances and consequences of application is implicitly committing yourself to the goodness of the inference from the circumstances to the consequences of application. Here, I think that implicit inferential commitment is particularly obvious in slurs or pejorative expressions. And Dummett really started the now flourishing philosophical study of the semantics, rather than the pragmatics in a low sense, of the semantics of slurs. He picked an expression that he was confident was archaic enough that it would offend no one. I've been told this is not true at all. It's the World War I expression Boche that the French used to refer to Germans, which my French friends say always was a contraction for Sale Boche, but they just used the expression. And Dummett's semantic analysis of it is that the circumstances of application are that someone is of German nationality, and the consequences of application, again, as the French during the First World War used it, were that they were barbarous and more prone to cruelty than other Europeans. And Dummett's point is, if you don't endorse the inference from German nationality to barbarity and cruelty. For instance, because you say, well, Goethe, Bach, Kant, if inspired by those counterexamples, you don't accept the inference from the circumstances to the consequences of application of that term, then all you can do is not use the term. You can't even use it negatively. That's the "some of my best friends are Bosch" use. Even in that negative use, you're attempting to take back the consequences of application that are part of the semantics of the term. Or if I say, well, look, there really are no Bosch. Again, that's denying that the circumstances of application applied, denying that there are any Germans. No, you just can't use the word. And I think of here Oscar Wilde at his trial. The prosecutor read out some of the more hair-raising passages from The Importance of Being Earnest, this play of Wilde's, and said, I put it to you, Mr. Wilde, that this is blasphemy. Is it or is it not blasphemy? And Wilde said exactly what he should say, according to Dummett. He said, sir, blasphemy is not one of my words. According to Dummett, that's all you can say if you don't accept the inference curled up between the circumstances and the consequences of application. And this comes up for sort of less obviously pejorative expressions, concepts like enemy of the people. You want to think very carefully about the circumstances and consequences of application of that. But ordinary scientific terms, the term temperature, we keep adding new circumstances of application, new consequences of application. That's how the meaning of the term evolves. We've got good inferences, by and large, curled up in that one. Okay, so the point of this maybe excursus was to raise see the question as being raised by the constructive theoretical endeavor that Price has given us here, the delineation of a new pragmatist norm of truth, a new understanding of a pragmatist norm of truth, in terms of how pragmatists should think about the relation between pragmatics and semantics, or as Rorty's vocabulary has taught us to translate that, the relation between our pragmatic metavocabulary and our semantic metavocabulary. Let me stop there for thoughts, responses. Okay, next bit of context, and this is something I realized afterwards I had missed the opportunity to talk about in response to Patrick's question last time. And this is the distinction between formal semantics and philosophical semantics. These are my terms. Other people use somewhat different ones. I'm lightly regimenting other use. But formal semantics has really only one job, and that is to show how to compute the semantic interpretance of complex expressions from the semantic interpretance of simple expressions. So paradigm truth tables, associate truth values with logically atomic sentences, and then the truth tables will show you how to associate truth values with logically complex sentences formed by applying truth functional connectives to them. But model theoretic semantics or possible world semantics work the same way. That's their job. These things started with the language of logic and then mathematics, and then were extended to other things. Philosophical semantics, as I use the expression, is the study of what it is about the use of expressions in virtue of which the connection between them and the semantic interpretants is established. How is it that by using the expressions, we confer those meanings? We establish the connection between the expression and the semantic interpretant, whatever the kind of semantic interpretant is. So, in the terms I was just talking, philosophical semantics is going to be conducted in a pragmatic metavocabulary, and we'll be addressing also using terms from the semantic metavocabulary. But formal semantics is going to take place just in the semantic metavocabulary. It doesn't care how the association of semantic interpretants with the primitive expressions, how that connection is established is just by stipulation. Tarski or Quine will just tell us what the domain of the model is and what the extension of the predicates is, and then we'll compute the extension corresponding to some complex quantificational expression. Now, what I called methodological pragmatism is telling us at some point you're going to need to do philosophical semantics. Otherwise, you can't tell the difference between semantics and just any bit of mathematics where you're computing something from something else. Rorty, I think, thought that there was no point to doing formal semantics, and therefore no point to doing philosophical semantics. Because he thought the representational model gave us no grip on what we were actually doing, the practices of using the language. Price is not, in the things that we read here, officially interested in formal semantics. He doesn't take it as a criterion of adequacy of his philosophical semantics that the semantic metavocabulary that he explains the use of to us in terms of the pragmatic metavocabulary. He doesn't take it as a criterion of adequacy on that you can use it to do formal semantics. He should. He should because he has the overall project, as we've seen, of synthesizing Rortian pragmatism with Humean expressivism, Hex, from his earlier article, of the kind that Simon Blackburn is an avatar of. And I described I characterized the distinction between first wave meta-ethical expressivists like Ayer and C.L. Stevenson on the one hand, and second wave meta-ethical expressivists like Blackburn himself and Alan Gibbard as consisting in whether they took seriously the Frege-Geach problem as a criterion of adequacy on an expressivist account. And remember, the Frege-Geach observation was that a declarativist has to give an account of the use of declarative sentences, not just as freestanding, force-bearing expressions whose utterance has the significance, the practical significance of an assertion, but also their embedded uses. Paradigmatically is the antecedent of a conditional, but in general, the contribution that their content makes to the content of more complex sentences containing them. That is, the second wave metaethical expressivists do take as a criterion of adequacy of what they're doing that you be able to do formal semantics on the basis of their expressivist account. That their account of the expressive role of these locutions fund a notion of content that will explain embedded, unasserted uses of those same declarative sentences when they don't have the expressive force that makes them mean what they mean. And this is what Blackburn does, is show how, tell a story about how playing the expressive role that he associates with morals and modals, anyway, as their primary expressive role, has the consequence of associating with them a kind of content that then can be used to understand the content of more complex expressions that it occurs embedded in, where one is not in the embedded uses, thereby approving or disapproving or whatever your expressive account is. That is, in order to synthesize Humean expressivism of the Blackburn sort with Rortian pragmatism, Price is going to have to accept as a criterion of adequacy the obligation of underwriting semantic contents that will permit a formal semantics as well. As I say, Price has not accepted this obligation. He hasn't explicitly rejected it either. He just doesn't address it. But his aspiration of unifying these traditions, I'm saying, commits him to doing that. I do take it as a criterion of adequacy. So what I was doing in the Truth and Assertability essay is exactly parallel to what Price is doing in The Truth is Convenient Friction. I'm working with reasons for, and he's working with reasons against, but otherwise we're making recognizably the same generic move. And I was not motivated by metaethical expressivism, though I was motivated by the Frege-Geach argument. I was motivated by the sheer beauty of formal semantics as David Lewis presents it. And here I'm thinking of his essay, General Semantics, which is a 1972 article and is general in that it goes beyond possible world semantics. It applies to possible world semantics, but it's using Lesniewski's categorical grammars as the basis for semantics. And let me rehearse a story one can tell in the general semantic terms of this Lewis essay. He says, start with basic syntactic categories. Let's start with a sentence. Sentences are category S and singular terms are category T. And then we can write we can produce compound categories from those simple categories. For instance, any expression that takes a singular term as an argument and gives you a sentence as an output, we can write as a T arrow S. And that'll be a one-place predicate. Because if you give a one-place predicate like walks, if you give it an argument, Benjamin Franklin, you get the result, Benjamin Franklin walks, that's a sentence. So that predicate walks, we can think of as being of this compound type T arrow S. And that means that we can think of an expression that takes a one-place predicate and gives you another one-place predicate, an adverb like slowly that takes walks and turns it into walks slowly. We can think of that syntactically as being of the compound syntactic category T arrow S, arrow T arrow S, because it takes a one-place predicate, a T arrow S, and turns it into a one-place predicate, T arrow S. Okay, so far that's just syntax. The general semantics says that means that whatever kind of semantic interpretant you want to associate with sentences and singular terms, you should compute the semantic interpretants of the more complex expressions in the same way. So for Lewis's favorite choice, he associates sentences with sets of possible worlds as their semantic interpretant. Intuitively, Benjamin Franklin walks is associated with a set of possible worlds in which it's true that Benjamin Franklin walks. And he associates with singular terms objects, Benjamin Franklin, well, really counterparts in each world, but that doesn't matter for these purposes. So he's going to associate with walks a function from objects to sets of possible worlds. Now, it doesn't have to be that. If you're Dummett, your semantic interpretant that you associate with a sentence is a pair of a set of circumstances of application and a set of consequences of application. And what you associate with a singular term is a set of recognition conditions. So you will associate with a one-place predicate as its semantic interpretant, a function from recognition conditions to pairs of circumstances and consequences of application. And when we turn the crank one more time and ask, what interpretant should we associate with adverbs? Well, it should be a function from the semantic interpretant of terms to the semantic interpretant of sentences, a function from those functions to a function from, say, objects to sets of possible worlds. So if you're Lewis, I'll just stay with Lewis now. An adverb like slowly should have as its semantic interpretant a function from functions from objects to sets of possible worlds to functions from objects to sets of possible worlds. And now when I observe that semantically adverbs come in two flavors, attributive and non-attributive. So if we think about adverbial phrases, if I walked in the garden, it follows that I walked. If I walked in my imagination, it doesn't follow that I walked. The first are attributive, the second are not. Well, now we can say exactly what the difference between those is in terms of the difference between functions from objects to sets of possible worlds to functions from objects to sets of possible worlds, which is the semantic interpretant of those adverbs. And we can say exactly what the difference is between the attributive and the non-attributive ones in terms of whether it's a consequence that, and now we have the function from objects to sets of possible worlds that is walks in it. Well, in my view, if you care about discursive practice, when you've seen this general semantic apparatus giving us a mathematical grip on meanings that is fine-grained enough that it can represent, it can express the difference between attributive and non-attributive adverbs here. That's a heaven that we can not expel ourselves from. It's going to be a constraint on our understanding of discursive practice that you can do that kind of semantics with it. It doesn't have to be possible worlds. You can be dumb it and use these more pragmatically motivatable terms. It doesn't matter what you associate with the T's and the S's in order to do a general semantics like this. So there's a story, the general semantics story, about the form of a semantic metavocabulary in which to do formal semantics. And furthermore, it comes with parameters. You pick your favorite semantic interpretant, your favorite kind of semantically relevant whatsits. What's going to make it your favorite? Well, presumably the philosophic semantic story that you tell. That is the story you tell about what it is about the use of expressions that, in virtue of which they're associated with these semantic interpretants. This is something that David Lewis realized was a big problem for him. What is it about our use of expressions that associates with them an uncountably infinite set of possible worlds, which for him are concrete particulars causally disconnected from our entire universe? What do I have to do to get in touch semantically with these things? Okay, that's a problem. That's a reason you might want more Demetian semantic primitives. But whatever philosophic semantic story you tell, that is, whatever story you tell in your pragmatic metavocabulary about the use of these semantic expressions, the ones you're then going to carry over and build your semantic metavocabulary around, whatever story you tell there, it seems to me it's a criterion of adequacy on it that you can do this kind of formal semantics with it. And the unifying move that I wanted to make is, if you want to do what Price wants to do in synthesizing the Humean expressivist tradition with the Rortian pragmatist tradition, then you need to do this. Happily, I think it can be done. It can be done in more than one way. But that's the task for, as it were, the next generation of constructive theoretical pragmatists, is to build on the kind of progress that Price has made here in these essays to usher us into that semantic heaven. Okay, that's the drawing together of the threads. Remember, I started reminding us about Rorty's persuasive and transformative redescription of pragmatism, the introduction of the vocabulary, bringing pragmatism past the linguistic turn, making it a view about discursive practices front and center. And then pointing out the kind of advance that Price has made, the kind of thing he's shown as possible in pragmatist terms, in underwriting semantic vocabulary, the use of semantic vocabulary in a pragmatic metavocabulary that ought to be acceptable to Rortian linguistic pragmatists. And what I've done for the rest of this session is put in place conceptual machinery that I think provides useful context for assessing that achievement of Price's. So I will stop there and invite questions or comments, thoughts about all that. Okay, well, let me say, I know that on the website, I'm throwing way more at you than you can read. This is one reason that I go to the trouble of extracting the passages that are going to be really important for us to think about. I do hope that sometimes, not every time, that you'll be interested enough in something that came up to sort of go back and sort of see it for yourself, whether you read it the first time and it sort of went by, or you didn't, but now you say, oh, well, maybe I should look at that bit. And my aim in building the website has been to make sure that sort of everything is there that you would need to look at to pursue one of these lines of thought if you find it interesting or decided you wanted to write about it. Okay, well, I will stop us here, but as always, I'll stick around in case somebody wants to chat afterwards. Otherwise, see you next week.